It's now my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Nat Read. Nat has written 5 books and a play. He's been published in dozens of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, my favorite paper, Saturday Evening Post, the LA5, Good Housekeeping, Boy's Life, Leatherneck, and Reader's Digest. He served on many boards in Southern California. He was board chair of the Pasadena Chamber of Commerce, president of the Public Relations Society of America, Los Angeles chapter. He's the current president of the Twilight Club of Pasadena. He served on the boards of the Jonathan Club, of which I am a fellow member, the Pasadena Museum of History, Glendale Symphony Orchestra Association, Los Angeles Urban League, and many others. His career has been public relations, heading his own agency, Read Communications, for the past 28 years, where he specializes in crisis management and government relations. He also earned his living as a cartoonist, advertising copywriter, and Chicago cab driver. Quite an eclectic background. He's a Vietnam veteran with 23 years in the Naval Reserve, where he retired as captain. He was a reserve street cop with LAPD, working vice in Hollywood and gang suppression in South Los Angeles. And he's appeared as a stand-up comedian in the Ice House Improv and Comedy Store. His daughter's a pediatrician, and his son is an attorney and PhD who teaches at Duke University. His wife... Thank you, Lane. That'll be fine. His wife, Linda, who was able to join us today at the head table, owns Auntie Anne's pretzel franchises in retail centers up and down the state. Finally, he's a member of the Rotary Club of Pasadena. So let's give a rousing LA5 welcome to today's speaker, Nat Read. My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my activities unwise and untimely. I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than any other city in the nation. Why direct action? Why the sit-ins, the marches, so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? Indeed, the very reason for direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. You call my activities untimely. Frankly, I have yet to be involved in a direct action campaign that was well-timed, in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait almost always means never. We've come to see, in the words of one of our distinguished jurists, that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We've waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights, but we creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at an election counter. Perhaps it is easy when you've never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will, drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted, your speech contorted, when you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to a public amusement park that was just advertised on television, and you see tears well up in her eyes when told that Funland is closed to colored children, and you see the ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little middle sky, and you see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious hatred toward white people. And when you're forced to create an answer for a 5-year-old son who asks, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? And when you take a cross-country drive They're forced to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by the nagging signs of white and colored, when your wife and your mother are never accorded the respected title of Mrs., when your first name is Nigger, your middle name is Boyd, regardless of your age, and your last name becomes John. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro living at tiptoe pace, never quite knowing what to expect next. When you are plagued with inner feelings of fear, outer feelings of resentment, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness. Then you will understand why we find it so difficult to wait. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. Since we so diligently ask people to obey the Supreme Court's 1954 decision outlawing segregation in public schools, at first it might seem somewhat paradoxical for us to urge people consciously to break laws. One might well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact there are two kinds of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. Conversely, one has a moral obligation to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal. And everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. Let us hope that in some not too distant future, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine forth over this great nation with all of their scintillating beauty. Yours in the cause of peace and freedom, Martin Luther King, Jr., April 16, 1963. That letter, written in the margins of newspapers and on scraps of toilet paper and stuffed into the underwear of the attorney Clarence Jones to get out of jail, was in response to a full-page ad signed by 8 clergymen. And that letter, in very refined and dignified language, said very clearly, you are an outsider, you are a rabble-rouser. We, the moral leadership of this state, will identify the problems in our community. We, the moral leadership, will decide how and when, if ever, they will be addressed. Get out of town. And these were no ordinary clergymen. This was the bishop of the Methodist Church, the auxiliary bishop of the Catholic Church, 2 bishops of the Episcopal Church, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church of the state of Alabama, the minister of the large Baptist Church, and the rabbi of the local synagogue. And the system that they were so ardently defending was one in which half of the community had to drink out of separate water fountains. Half had to use separate and certainly not equal restroom facilities. No black American could eat in a white restaurant anywhere in the South, had to go around to the screen door in back and politely ask for some food. Couldn't ride in a white taxi cab. If injured and near death on the pavement, could not be transported to the hospital in a white ambulance. At a department store, could not try on a suit of clothes, lest a white person might want to try on that same suit at a later time. And I understood to my very core what those clergymen were saying, because my own pastor of the largest Presbyterian church in the South felt the same way. He was the moderator of the General Assembly of the whole Presbyterian church in the South. My parents felt that way. My aunts and uncles, every adult that I knew in the South, growing up in the 40s and 50s, felt the same way. Their grandfathers had all fought in the Civil War. That generation's grandparents grandfathers for the South, and that war was in a long period of truce. It was in a ceasefire. That war was not a man who had written a letter from a Birmingham jail and who was speaking in pulpits in black churches throughout the South, and he was appearing in the crude dots of early black and white television across America. And he was saying, if enough of us act, they will have to listen. And when they listen, they will have to change. And when they change, we shall overcome. And I marched with Martin Luther King. I marched with him, and we flowed like a river between a flume of white spectators along the curb. And they singled me out as a white guy in that crowd with a hatred in their eyes like I had never seen before or since. And I returned that glare, and I sang with the people around me to the top of my lungs. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Now, I was a conservative. I was a conservative student. I was voting about that time in my first presidential election. I voted for Nixon, not Kennedy. This wasn't a matter of liberal versus conservative. This was common human decency. And besides, as a conservative, all of the figures in my pantheon of heroes were liberals. All of them. And that's true of you too. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, beyond liberal, radicals willing to kill in an armed revolt against a legitimate conservative government. Abraham Lincoln upended an institution that was intrinsic and fundamental to the 11 most conservative states in the Union. An institution that stretched back through the mist of history to the very earliest colonization of our biological species. An institution with ample justification throughout the Old and New Testaments of our Bible. And you have to remember that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And Republicans in the 19th century were the liberals. Democrats were the conservatives, just the opposite of what it is today. Democrats were forced labor. Socrates, liberal. Moses, rebel. Jesus, a liberal up against a conservative, secular, and religious establishment. And why do we as conservatives honor those who were so liberal in their own days? Because they represented fundamental human principles that transcend time and place. And after 50 years, can't we look back at Martin Luther King through that same prism of history and see how we respect what he stood for? What is so radical about an American being able to sit down and eat in an American restaurant? What is so radical about an American being able to register to vote, to run for office? These are core conservative principles today. Key platforms of my Republican Party. Every Martin Luther King Day, we see a parade of black faces on television extolling a black leader. And we fall into the trap, if we're not careful, of thinking of Martin Luther King in this pigeonhole, this category of great minority, rather than great American. But he was not just a hero of the minority. He changed life fundamentally for the majority. Latinos saw in his movement the same discrimination that they faced, and they demanded the same redress. Women, whose movement was separate and growing, seized upon that momentum to ask that when legislation was formed at the pressure of Martin Luther King, that they be included as gender as well as ethnicity. And as a result, 61% of Americans have better lives today because of Martin Luther King. And 100% of American families. My wife has a successful business. My daughter is medical doctor. My granddaughter is studying in a university for a profession on paths that simply would not have been that level had it been not for Martin Luther King. Our founding fathers founded this republic on the pinpoint of 5 words: all men are created equal. 47 years later, Abraham Lincoln advanced that principle with the manumission of slaves. And 100 years later, Martin Luther King, operating again on that same continuum of equality, brought about a reality that was only the vaguest ethereal dream to the founding fathers and Abraham Lincoln. He caused there to be equal justice under the law of the United States of America. And doesn't he deserve the same Mount Rushmorean perch that we put those other figures on? I think he does. Now, I don't agree with everything that Martin Luther King said. I don't agree with everything Martin Luther King did. But I don't agree with everything that Thomas Jefferson said. And I don't agree with everything that Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams said. Martin Luther King was born in 1929 as Mike King, Jr. His father, when he was 5 years old, went to court and changed his name, Mike King Sr. and Mike King Jr., to Martin Luther King Sr. and Martin Luther King Jr. He was a bright lad. He went to college at 15, Morehouse College, a divinity degree from Crozer Theological Seminary, and a PhD in philosophy from Boston University. And he accepted a call to the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, and was just establishing himself there when on December the 1st, 1955, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a public bus to a white man. And Martin Luther King, and that triggered her arrest, which triggered a boycott of the bus system, which Martin Luther King, at age 26, was pressed into service to lead. And that leadership catapulted him into national and international prominence. Martin Luther King, in the 11 years between 1957 and 1968, traveled 6 million miles. He spoke to 1,500 audiences. He was beaten repeatedly. His house was firebombed. He wrote 5 books. He received 5 honorary doctorate degrees. At age 34, he was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. And at age 35, he was the youngest person ever to become a Nobel laureate. The peak of his career, perhaps, was August the 28th, 1968. He stood in front of 250,000 people who had come to the Washington Mall in a march for jobs and justice. The logistics of organizing that had been so pressing that he did not have time, and knew he would not have time, to give any thought to his speech until 12 hours before he was to face the microphone. He looked at the speech that had been written for him by 2 of his associates. One of those was Clarence Jones, the same guy that got the letter out of the Birmingham jail. And he approved that speech, had it mimeographed, distributed it to the press, and that is the speech that he took to the lectern. It was a speech about the bank of freedom and justice established by the founding fathers, and the fact that when black Americans had gone to the bank, their check had come back stamped insufficient funds. It was a wonderful speech, and it's a speech that's used in speaking classes throughout the country. But Mahalia Jackson, who had just sung before Martin Luther King spoke, was not so happy with it. She was off the platform in the audience, but close enough to be heard. And 9 minutes and 2 seconds into that speech, Martin Luther King paused between 2 words, and Mahalia Jackson yelled out from where she was, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." Martin Luther King froze, became almost catatonic, and he straightened the pages of that speech that had been prepared for him, and he put it aside. And on the fly, he began to grab phrases that he had used in this speech and that to one audience after another. I am not unmindful that many of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells, and some of you have come here from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair, I say to you today, my friends. So, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It's a dream rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state with its sweltering heat of oppression, with its oppressive heat of discrimination, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor, with his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, that one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that every valley will be exalted, every hill and mountain will be made low, every rough place will be made plain, and every crooked place will be made straight. That the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope, and this is the faith that I go back to the South with. With that faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With that faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With that faith, we will be able to work together, pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. And this will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside let freedom reign. If America is to be a great nation, this must be true. And so let freedom reign from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom reign from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom reign from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom reign from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom reign from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom reign from Stone Mountain, Georgia. Let freedom reign from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom reign from every hill and every molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom reign. And when this happens, when we allow freedom to reign, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, every state and every city, we will be able to speed the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.